Welcome to reform thinking.
Yeah.
Usually when we talk about a physical diagnosis, right, like there is this certain comfort in the expectation of, I don't know, mechanical precision.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we love that.
Right, like you fall, you fracture a bone, the x-ray spits out this high contrast image of a jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it with absolute certainty. The problem is observable, the treatment is standard, and, the metric for healing is just completely straightforward.
Right. It's all grounded in empirical clarity. And I mean, we crave that kind of clarity in almost every domain of our lives. We want to be able to just, isolate a point to the exact point of failure and apply a targeted fix. It kind of gives us this illusion of total control over our environment and our own bodies.
Yeah, but, and here is the problem, the moment you attempt to apply that exact same framework to the interior life of a Christian, like to spiritual development and the actual architecture of the soul, that whole diagnostic machinery completely fails.
Wow, completely breaks down.
It really does. We find ourselves looking at a landscape that is profoundly complex, highly subjective in how we experience it, and let's be honest, often incredibly murky. But today we are taking a deep dive into a historical source that actually attempts to provide that exact kind of spiritual diagnostic clarity.
Which is pretty rare, honestly.
It is. We are unpacking a sermon delivered by Charles H. Spurgeon way back on July 1st, 1855, at the New Park Street Chapel in Southwark. It's titled, "The Necessity of Increased Faith," and it's built entirely around this very short, very desperate four-word plea from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 5.
And, the timing of this sermon is really worth noting before we even look at the text itself. I mean, July 1855, this puts Spurgeon at the very, very beginning of his ministry in London. He is barely 21 years old at this point.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. It's crazy. And yet, he is speaking to this massive congregation that's trying to navigate the absolute height of the Victorian era. So you're talking about a period marked by rapid industrialization, brutal urban poverty, devastating cholera outbreaks, and just profound social upheaval.
Wow. Yeah. So not exactly a calm, quiet time.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So he is not up there delivering this abstract ivory tower theology to people living these cushy, comfortable lives. He is speaking to people who desperately need robust operational tools just to survive the spiritual and physical grind of their daily existence.
And for you listening, that is exactly the mission of our discussion today.
Yeah.
You're here because you are looking for thorough foundational knowledge about the mechanics of the Christian life. We aren't going to treat faith merely as like an abstract point of systematic theology, though. I mean, it certainly is that.
Yeah, it definitely is.
But we are going to examine it as a highly practical operational engine. We want to understand the why and the how behind Spurgeon's analysis, unpacking the underlying logic of faith so that it becomes something you can actually observe functioning in your own life.
Exactly. And to understand the sheer power and necessity of this faith, we really first have to understand the specific moment of desperation that provoked the apostles to ask for it in the first place. We have to look at the context of that cry in Luke 17:5, where they literally just say, increase our faith.
Right. So set the scene for us. What is actually happening there?
Well, Spurgeon approaches this text with the mind of a diagnostician, trying to find the root cause of a symptom, like you mentioned earlier. And he notes that biblical scholars actually debate the exact chronological context of this cry from the apostles. So he presents two distinct possibilities from the surrounding narrative.
Okay, two possibilities. What's the first one?
So the first possibility locates this cry in a deeply relational, highly internal struggle. Just prior to this verse, Jesus had been teaching his disciples about the staggering, and I mean staggering, requirements of interpersonal forgiveness.
Oh, right. The 7 times a day thing?
Exactly. He didn't simply tell them to forgive a one-off offense. He instituted what is basically a mathematical impossibility for the natural human heart. He commanded that if a brother trespasses against them 7 times in a single day and 7 times turns back and says, I repent, they're absolutely obligated to forgive him.
The psychological weight of that command is just immense. I mean, forgiving someone once is difficult enough, but to have the exact same person violate your boundaries, harm you, or betray you 7 times before the sun goes down, and to be required to incessantly extend genuine pardon each and every time.
It's exhausting just to think about.
It really is. It requires a well of grace that just does not naturally exist in the human psyche. I mean, by the 3rd or 4th time, basic human logic dictates that, hey, This repentance is totally manipulative, and my forgiveness is just being foolish.
Yeah, it violates every single instinct of self-preservation we have. And the disciples, they recognize this instantly. They hear this command and immediately realize their own internal reserves of patience and grace are just entirely bankrupt.
Right.
To continuously pardon repeated cyclical offenses in a single day is a duty so agonizingly difficult that they just feel completely unequipped to perform it. It demands this sort of supernatural resilience to interpersonal trauma.
Okay, so that sets up the first context, the sheer exhaustion of human relationships and the demand for unnatural, radical forgiveness. But Spurgeon also provides a second possible context, right? And I think he suggests this one might carry even more weight.
He does, yeah. This second scenario completely shifts the focus from an internal relational struggle to a violently external spiritual one.
Okay, what's the situation here?
In this second framework, Spurgeon connects their cry to the events following the Mount of Transfiguration. So the disciples who remained at the bottom of the mountain had been approached by a father whose son was possessed by a violently destructive evil spirit. The disciples attempted to cast the demon out and, well, they failed utterly.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a very public failure.
Exactly. They were publicly humiliated, exposed as spiritually impotent right in front of the scribes and the crowds. Later on, in private, they asked Jesus why they were unable to cast it out, and Jesus directly indicts their unbelief. He tells them that if they had faith just like a grain of mustard seed, they could command a mountain to move or a sycamore tree to be uprooted and planted in the sea.
So we have two radically divergent scenarios here. On the one hand, you have the quiet, grueling internal struggle of just forgiving a repeatedly offensive brother. And on the other hand, you have a terrifying supernatural confrontation with demonic forces that results in complete public failure.
Yeah, completely different situations.
The demands of these two situations could not look more different on the surface. I mean, one requires immense emotional regulation, and the other requires raw spiritual authority over the unseen realm.
And this is where the brilliance of Spurgeon's exegesis really shines. He synthesizes these two disparate events beautifully. He observes that regardless of whether the primary stressor was the mundane grind of relational conflict or the extraordinary terror of spiritual warfare, the apostles diagnosed their own deficiency in exactly the same way.
Which is fascinating.
It is, because they didn't ask for a greater capacity for empathy to deal with the offending brother. They didn't ask for enhanced mystical authority or better incantations to deal with the demon. In the face of both the mundane and the supernatural impossible, their unified cry was simply, increase our faith.
Which indicates that faith is the universal currency for Christian obedience. It isn't just the mechanism by which we are initially justified, but it's the ongoing operational fuel required for literally every subsequent action. If faith is the specific tool required to accomplish everything from forgiving a petty insult to binding an evil spirit, I mean, that completely redefines how we view our daily struggles. When we fail to forgive or when we are overcome by temptation, the root failure isn't actually a lack of willpower, it's a deficiency in our faith.
Yeah, and Spurgeon frames their request as an act of profound, necessary self-awareness born out of failure. They recognized that the machinery of their spiritual lives had just ground to a halt. And to illustrate the necessity of this realization for the average believer, Spurgeon employs this really striking military contrast.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, he looks at the apostles. These are men who lived alongside the incarnate Christ, who witnessed the miracles firsthand, who are endowed with apostolic authority. He calls them the 12 mightiest in the army of the Lord of hosts.
Let me push back or ask a framing question here because I think it's important. Does Spurgeon suggest that the apostles' request was a sign of weakness, or was it a sign of profound self-awareness? Like, should they have known better?
Oh, it was absolute self-awareness. And his argument here is an argument from the greater to the lesser. If the elite vanguard of this spiritual army, the frontline generals who possessed physical proximity to Jesus, found their faith so deficient that they had to cry out for an emergency supply drop, or what does that say about the rest of us?
Right. He uses this wonderful phrase to describe his congregation. He calls them the interior soldiers and the feeblest saints.
Which just strips away any pretense of spiritual self-sufficiency. If the apostles were totally bankrupt without an active, increasing impartation of faith, then the person sitting in a pew in 19th century London or the person listening to us today is entirely dependent on that exact same impartation. The necessity of increasing faith is universal across the entire hierarchy of the church.
So if faith is truly this universal mechanism, If it is the indispensable tool for both basic sanctification and frontline spiritual warfare, then we really need to examine exactly where faith sits in the hierarchy of Christian virtues. We need to map it out. And Spurgeon asserts that faith is not just one virtue among many, it is the fundamental linchpin that holds the entire operation of salvation together.
He really leans heavily into the exclusivity of faith in the economy of salvation, which is, of course, a total hallmark of Reformed theology.
Hmm.
He states unequivocally that faith is the salvation grace. We are saved by grace, but specifically through faith.
Right.
God has sovereignly chosen to attach the gift of salvation exclusively to the exercise of faith and to literally no other human action or disposition.
And he is incredibly stark about this exclusivity. He points out that the scriptures nowhere promise salvation to the person who merely loves or the person who is merely patient. The decree isn't, he that loveth shall be saved, nor is it a patient sinner shall be saved. The decree is exclusively he that believeth. The author of Hebrews states that without faith, it is impossible to please God. But let's look at the theological mechanics here because they're crucial. Why does God elevate faith over love in the matter of justification, especially when Paul later says in Corinthians that the greatest of these is love?
It's a great question. And the distinction really lies in the nature of the virtues themselves and how they function in relation to God's grace. So love, patience, courage, these are active virtues. They are things we produce, things that require a degree of inherent goodness or effort, even if they're aided by grace.
Okay, yeah.
If salvation were based on love, it would fundamentally be based on our performance. But faith, at least in the Reformed understanding, is inherently receptive. It is an empty vessel. It is the instrumental cause of justification because it contributes absolutely nothing of its own merit. It merely looks away from itself to receive the imputed righteousness of Christ.
It's the only virtue that actively renounces self-reliance.
Exactly, which makes it the perfect non-meritorious instrument for receiving a salvation that is entirely by grace.
It really is the difference between building a bridge and just crossing one that is already built. To visualize what Spurgeon is arguing about the structural necessity of faith, imagine the construction of a stone arch.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. You can quarry these massive, beautiful stones. You can carve one stone to represent patience. You can carve another to represent courage, another to represent diligence, and another to represent love. You can stack them up meticulously. But unless you place the keystone of faith at the very apex, that central stone that locks all the others into place by transferring their weight down into the foundation of Christ, the entire arch just lacks structural integrity.
It relaxes.
Exactly. The moment any pressure is applied, it collapses into a pile of rubble. Spurgeon uses the word non-entity. Without faith, regardless of whatever other moral virtues you possess, your Christian life is a non-entity.
And Spurgeon utilizes his own metaphors to enforce this reality, really leaning into the industrial and martial imagery of his day. He uses this powerful maritime illustration. He says, remove faith, you have sawn through the ship's keel, and she must sink.
Wow.
Right. Because the keel is the central foundational beam running along the bottom of a ship's hull, providing all the stability and structural framework. You can have magnificent sails, you can have sturdy masts and experienced crew, but if the keel is severed, the vessel will inevitably break apart in the water. And he follows this up with a military image saying, take away faith, you've taken away my shield, and I must be slain.
The stakes he outlines are just absolute. It is a literal matter of life and death, of sinking or swimming, of surviving the battlefield or perishing. But, because faith occupies this vital, exclusive role in salvation, it naturally becomes the prime target for counterfeit.
Oh, absolutely.
If faith is the only currency accepted at the gates of heaven, there will inevitably be widespread counterfeiting of that currency. And Spurgeon issues a really severe warning against what he terms notional faiths and sham faiths.
And this is where his pastoral diagnostic work becomes incredibly piercing. He understands the human propensity for self-deception, particularly in heavily religious cultures like Victorian England, where nominal Christianity was basically the societal default.
Right, everybody went to church.
Exactly. So he warns that there are 1,000 imitations of faith, but only one vital saving reality. A notional faith, as he defines it, is a purely intellectual exercise. It is the ability to hold a perfectly sound creed, to pass a theological examination, and to yield intellectual assent to the historical facts of the gospel, while remaining utterly devoid of a living, vital trust in the person of Jesus Christ.
He argues that this kind of notional faith is actually more dangerous than outright atheism.
Yeah, because it's deceptive.
Exactly, because it bids men believe a lie by wrapping them in false assurances of safety. A person can possess a flawless exterior. They can be as earnest in their religious duties as a seraph, and as diligent in their moral conduct as an angel, yet still be marching straight toward damnation with their eyes closed because their faith is a sham. It's the terrifying reality that intellectual orthodoxy does not equal spiritual life.
He urges his congregation to subject their faith to rigorous examination. He uses the analogy of a merchant examining a coin. Merchant does not just glance at a coin, right?
Mm,
He weighs it, he bites it, he checks its edges to ensure it is genuine sterling silver and not just lead painted to look like silver.
I love that imagery.
Yeah, and Spurgeon says we must do exactly the same with our faith. We can examine our conduct and our works as secondary evidences, sure, but the primary investigation must be the authenticity of our faith. Because if the faith is a counterfeit, the entire structure of the soul is compromised.
So, recognizing faith as the absolute prerequisite for salvation and the ultimate touchstone of spiritual sincerity, it really forces us to reevaluate how we view the rest of the Christian life. If faith is the foundational keel and the receptive empty hand, what exactly is its relationship to the active virtues? The love, the patience, the zeal. If faith alone justifies us before God, do these other virtues just operate independently on like a parallel track?
And this transition in Spurgeon's logic is profound, because he argues that the virtues do not operate independently at all. He identifies faith not merely as the prerequisite for salvation, but as the mother of virtues and the root grace. He posits that every other grace is entirely dependent on faith for its genesis and its continued existence.
He traces a direct, unbreakable causal relationship. He doesn't just suggest that faith is foundational. He argues that faith actually manufactures the other virtues through its operation in the mind and heart.
We can deconstruct his logic by looking at the virtue of love, for instance.
Yeah.
Spurgeon asks, how can a person genuinely love a God in whom they do not first believe?
Right, you can't.
The sequence is logically fixed. If you do not possess a firm, abiding belief in the existence of God, and more specifically, in the benevolent character of God as revealed in Christ, the affection of love has literally no object to attach itself to. Love for God is the necessary emotional and volitional response to the apprehension of God's love for us, which is apprehended solely by faith.
You cannot love a void. The affection requires a perceived reality, and faith is the mechanism that perceives that reality. And he applies this exact same causal chain to patience. Patience in the midst of profound distress isn't merely a psychological exercise in stoicism or, emotional suppression.
No, not at all.
True Christian patience is the act of resting in a specific promise, the promise that God is sovereign and that all things are working together for the good of those who love him. If you lack faith in the validity of that promise, you have no anchor in the storm. Your patience will inevitably fracture under the weight of suffering.
Therefore, Spurgeon arrives at this devastating but mathematically precise conclusion. The man of little faith is naturally the man of little love.
That concept forces a radical shift in how we diagnose our own spiritual struggles. When we find ourselves lacking in love for our neighbor or lacking patience with our circumstances, our default human response is to try and manufacture those specific virtues through sheer willpower.
Right, I just need to try harder.
Exactly. We tell ourselves, I just need to try harder to be patient. But Spurgeon's diagnostic model says we are treating the symptom, not the disease. If your love is shrinking, it is because your faith has shrunk. If your courage is evaporating, it is because your trust in the promises of God has evaporated. He says, faith is the water which nurtures the root. Faith is the sap which imparts vitality to all the branches.
And if you restrict the flow of sap, the branches wither and die, regardless of how much you command them to bear fruit. He offers another exquisite visual here. Faith is the silver thread upon which the pearls of the graces are strung. If you break the thread of faith, all the pearls of virtue, your patience, your joy, your peace, they just scatter onto the floor. You cannot wear them, you cannot display them, because the unifying mechanism is gone.
But wait, this introduces a fascinating theological tension that Spurgeon has to navigate carefully. The Reformed tradition is fiercely protective of the glory of Christ in salvation. We are justified by the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ alone. Christ is the one who secures salvation. Yet, Spurgeon proceeds to argue that Christ essentially abdicates his own visible glory in the moment of healing to place it upon faith.
He does, yeah.
He says Christ takes the crown off his own head to put it onto faith's head,
Wow.
making faith the king of kings among virtues. So to an audience deeply trained in the doctrines of grace, doesn't elevating faith to the seat of honor risk turning faith itself into a work?
It is the razor's edge of Protestant theology, and Spurgeon balances on it with incredible precision. He explicitly reiterates the core doctrine. Now, it is not faith that saves, it is Christ that saves.
Right. Faith is merely the conduit.
Exactly. But having secured that doctrinal boundary, he invites his audience to observe how Jesus actually operated and spoke during his incarnate ministry. Time and again, when Christ performs a miraculous healing or grants a profound request, he does not highlight his own omnipotence in his concluding remarks. He repeatedly tells the recipient, "Thy faith hath saved thee," or "Thy faith hath made thee whole."
It is a deliberate, rhetorical uncrowning. He redirects the spotlight from his own divine agency to the human exercise of trust. And to illustrate why Christ does this and why he prizes faith above all other responses, Spurgeon directs our attention to the narrative of the Syrophoenician woman. This is arguably one of the most intense, psychologically demanding encounters in the entire gospel record.
Oh, the dynamics of that narrative are just staggering. So here's a Gentile woman, a cultural outsider, who approaches Jesus because her daughter is grievously afflicted by a demon. She crosses cultural boundaries and violates social norms just to plead for mercy. And Jesus' initial response is silence.
Just silence.
Yes. And when he finally speaks, he tests her faith with a severity that really borders on cruelty to the modern ear. He tells her that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, and he uses a culturally charged, highly offensive metaphor, stating that it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs.
It is a moment completely designed to provoke offense and retreat. I mean, almost anyone else would have been crushed by the rejection or infuriated by the insult. But her response is a masterclass in theological leverage.
It really is.
She absorbs the insult without contesting her own unworthiness, and she traps Jesus in the logic of his own metaphor. She says, "Truth, Lord, but the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table." She essentially argues that the overflow of his grace is so abundant that even the scraps of his power are sufficient to heal her daughter without depriving the children of Israel of their portion.
It is an astonishing display of spiritual tenacity. Now, Spurgeon asks us to analyze what Jesus praises in that moment. Consider the multitude of virtues she has just vividly demonstrated. Jesus could have looked at her and said, "O woman, great is thy maternal love," because she endured public humiliation for the sake of her child.
Yeah, or he could have said, "Great is thy patience," because she withstood repeated rejection without giving up.
Right. He could have commended her profound humility in accepting the designation of a dog, or her immense intellectual wisdom in turning the metaphor to her advantage.
She exhibited a constellation of the higher human virtues, but Jesus ignores the love, he ignores the patience, he ignores the humility, and he ignores the wit. His sole commendation is, "O woman, great is thy faith."
Christ bypasses every other gleaming pearl to place the crown entirely upon the thread of faith. He places faith in the forefront of the forehead of virtue. Spurgeon's argument to his listeners is simple. We must esteem what Christ esteems. If the incarnate Son of God treats faith as the choicest gem in the human soul, it is impossible for us to place too high a premium upon it.
So we have established the internal architecture. Faith is the non-meritorious keel of justification. It is the root system that generates all other virtues, and it is the singular grace crowned by Christ. But theology has to move from the interior of the soul out into the hostile environment of the world. How does this internally generated faith operate externally? How does it actually interact with the divine realm to produce tangible results on earth?
Well, this moves us into Spurgeon's analysis of faith as the ultimate instrument of divine communication and the ultimate defensive posture against the world. He argues that faith is the exclusive conduit for obtaining blessings from God. It is the sole communication link between humanity and heaven.
And to articulate this, Spurgeon reaches for what was, in 1855, the absolute bleeding edge of technological advancement. He calls faith the telegraphic wire which links earth and heaven.
Which is such a cool analogy.
It really is. And we have to pause and appreciate the paradigm shift the telegraph represented to the Victorian mind. I mean, for all of human history prior to that moment, information could only travel as fast as a physical body could carry it. A man on a horse, a ship catching the wind, a carrier pigeon. Suddenly, the telegraph allowed messages to be transmitted electronically, essentially at the speed of light, across vast distances. It totally annihilated the tyranny of geography.
By harnessing that specific cultural awe, Spurgeon radically redefines how his congregation perceives prayer. Prayer is no longer this message placed in a bottle and thrown into the cosmic ocean, hoping it washes up on the shores of heaven years later.
Right.
Faith turns prayer into a high-speed, real-time electronic transmission over a live wire. He says it on this telegraphic wire of faith. God's blessings move with such immediacy that before we call, he answers, and while we are yet speaking, he hears us.
It paints a picture of a hyper-connected, dynamic relationship. But, it also comes with a stark warning about the mechanics of the system. A telegraph only works if the wire is intact. If the wire is severed, you can tap the Morse key all day long, but nothing is transmitted. Spurgeon asks, if that wire of faith is snapped, how can we receive the promise? If you are in profound trouble and you need divine intervention, you call for help over the wire. But take faith away, and the road between the soul and heaven is blocked.
He reinforces this with a flurry of other metaphors to ensure the point really lands. He calls faith a winter road for the horses of prayer.
A winter road.
Yeah, in a time before paved highways, a muddy road in winter was totally impassable. But if the ground froze solid, a horse-drawn carriage could travel swiftly. Faith provides the solid ground for prayer to travel. He also employs the mythological image of King Midas, whose touch turned everything to gold. Spurgeon suggests that faith is the Christian's Midas touch. It extracts spiritual gold from every circumstance, whether sorrow or joy. But destroy faith, and we are left miserably poor, unable to hold any fellowship with the divine. Faith is the angelic messenger. If you ground the messenger, no prayers ascend and no answers descend.
The telegraph wire secures our supply line from heaven, but faith must also engage with the hostility of the world. Spurgeon shifts from communication to combat, calling faith the ultimate shield. He points to the Apostle Paul's detailed description of the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. Paul lists the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of the gospel of peace. But then Paul inserts a specific caveat of priority. Above all, taking the shield of faith. Why does the shield receive the designation above all?
Spurgeon breaks down the practicality of ancient armor to explain this. The breastplate only protects the torso, the helmet only protects the head. But the Roman scutum, the large shield Paul was referencing, was designed to protect the entire body and could be moved to intercept attacks from any direction.
I see.
Spurgeon argues that even if you momentarily lack the full comfort of your helmet of salvation, if you retain your shield of faith, you can still ward off a fatal blow. But if you drop the shield, your entire spiritual anatomy is exposed to the fiery darts of the enemy. Faith is what engages the omnipotence of Jehovah on the believer's behalf, providing what Spurgeon calls a true nobility of soul.
And he refuses to leave this as an abstract theological concept. He grounds it in the raw data of history. He argues that the victories achieved by faith far surpass the greatest geopolitical military conquests of human history. He literally commands his audience, "Tell me not of the victories of Wellington. Mention not the battles of Napoleon. Tell me of what faith has done." For a British preacher in the mid-19th century, waving off the Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, is an astonishing rhetorical flex.
It really is. He's deliberately subverting the Victorian obsession with empire and military might. He directs their gaze away from the battlefields of Europe to the monuments of faith recorded in Scripture and history. He reminds them that it was faith that shut the mouths of lions for Daniel. It was faith that parted the Red Sea for Moses. It was faith that empowered Jael to slay Sisera. Faith operates as a disruptive supernatural force that alters the physical reality of the world.
And he brings it closer to home, tapping into British Protestant history. He recounts the famous assertion regarding the Scottish reformer John Knox. Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic monarch who fiercely opposed the Reformation, famously declared that she feared the prayers and the faith of John Knox more than she feared an invading army of 10,000 men.
Think about the mechanics of that fear for a second. A monarch possesses the machinery of the state armies, prisons, executioners. John Knox possessed none of those things. He was a single man armed only with a Bible and a live telegraph wire to heaven. Yet the Queen accurately calculated the geopolitical threat. She understood that Knox's faith engaged an omnipotent power that her armies could not defeat. Spurgeon warns, "I should not like to have a man of faith opposing me. His blows strike hard, and when he does smite, he smites home, as with a rod of iron."
Faith is portrayed as a triumphant, giant-slaying, king-terrifying force. But we have to ground this in the reality of the listener. I mean, defeating armies of 10,000 men and pulling down fire from heaven sounds magnificent, But most of us are not fighting monarchs or parting seas. We are navigating the mundane, grinding realities of modern life raising children, paying mortgages, enduring chronic illness, dealing with difficult coworkers. How does this triumphant faith translate into the daily duty and the quiet sufferings of the average believer?
Spurgeon is profoundly pastoral here, and he does not ignore the mundane. He argues that without faith, you cannot perform even the most basic Christian duty. He calls faith the foot of the soul by which we march along the rugged road of the commandments. Love might make the feet move faster, creating a sense of joy in the obedience, but faith is the anatomical structure of the foot itself. Without it, there is no forward progress.
He also uses a mechanical metaphor, calling faith the oil that enables the wheels of holy devotion to move. Without faith, the wheels are taken off the chariot, and our spiritual duties become a massive, heavy burden that we are just dragging along the ground.
And, dragging along heavily is an incredibly accurate diagnosis of how many believers experience their faith. It feels like an obligation rather than an engine. To address this, Spurgeon introduces a critical diagnostic distinction between what he calls little faith and great faith.
This distinction is vital because it addresses a fundamental question about the baseline requirements for salvation versus the requirements for a robust Christian life. How does little faith operate differently than great faith?
Well, Spurgeon offers a comforting yet challenging pastoral realism here. He explicitly affirms that little faith is sufficient for justification. You can cross the finish line into heaven with little faith. It is enough to secure the salvation of the soul because the object of the faith, Christ, is strong, even if the apprehension of him is weak. But, and this is the crucial pivot, little faith is entirely incapable of accomplishing great things in the present world.
He paints a rather pathetic picture of little faith. He says it constantly has to run and hide itself in a nutshell. It survives the journey, sure, but it loses all its baggage along the way. It arrives at the gates of heaven having retained nothing but its core jewels, meaning its bare salvation. It produces no great works, it builds no temples, it converts no enemies.
And this raises a profound tension for the believer. If minimal mustard seed faith is sufficient to guarantee eternal security, what is the incentive to cultivate anything more? If a believer is going to heaven regardless, why should they endure the agonizing process of stretching and increasing their faith? Why not just hunker down in the nutshell, avoid the conflict, and settle for being barely saved?
That minimalist approach to Christianity is precisely what Spurgeon is trying to dismantle. And to do it, he turns to the ultimate allegorical roadmap of the Puritan tradition, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He reminds his congregation of the specific characters in Bunyan's narrative. There is a literal character named Little Faith. And what happens to Little Faith? He gets mugged by thieves on the highway. He is easily robbed of his spending money, his daily comfort and joy.
Exactly. When the terrifying demon Apollyon straddles the road, or when the pilgrims are trapped in the dungeon of giant despair, little faith is utterly useless. He cannot fight the monster, he cannot pick the lock on the dungeon. Those massive existential battles required the characters named Christian and Greatheart. Spurgeon's point is that if you intend to do anything of value in this life, if you want to withstand the cultural behemoths, build lasting spiritual temples, or stand firm before your enemies, you must possess great faith. The kingdom of God is not advanced by people hiding in nutshells.
He drives this home with a series of vivid, contrasting animal metaphors. He compares great faith to the biblical monster behemoth, describing it as a force that can snuff up Jordan at a draft. It can swallow an entire rushing river of opposition without choking. But little faith is drowned in a single drop of rain.
That's quite the contrast.
Isn't it? Little faith contemplates abandoning the journey at the first sign of a gray cloud. Great faith can carry a mountain of affliction on its back. Little faith stumbles and breaks its ankle over a molehill.
But Spurgeon's concern is not merely utilitarian. He is not just interested in what faith can accomplish. He is deeply concerned with the internal experience of the believer, the matter of comfort. He actively pushes back against a trend among the ministers of his day. Apparently, there were pastors in London who mocked their congregations for desiring comfort, preaching a harsh, stoic brand of religion. They would chide their people saying, you are always saying you want comfort.
And Spurgeon's response to those ministers is brutally direct. He says, to be sure, they do, and they want it because they never get it from you, sir.
It is a sharp pastoral rebuke. Spurgeon fundamentally believes that God's people require the cordial of faith because the reality of life in a fallen world is brutal. The road to heaven is rough, the flints are sharp, and the thorns are thick.
He contrasts how little faith and great faith process this suffering. Little Faith sits murmuring in a corner, mingling her tears with the flood, overwhelmed by the circumstances. But great faith is found singing in the midst of the fire. Great faith looks at the jagged rocks on the path, looks at the strong iron shoes of grace God has provided, says, I will even venture, and marches off with confidence.
He uses avian imagery to summarize the choice before the listener. He urges them not to be Christian owls, creatures that only fly about in the dark, hooting in gloom and misery. He calls them to be Christian larks that mount up into the sunshine and carol in the daylight. His underlying argument is that while you may be saved with little faith, you will not be saved happily. The quality, the joy, and the usefulness of your earthly journey are entirely dependent on the magnitude of your faith.
Which brings us to a profound paradox in Spurgeon's text. We have just spent considerable time exploring faith as this mighty behemoth that drinks rivers, slays giants, and terrifies monarchs. It is the unbreakable telegraph wire and the impenetrable Roman shield. Yet, immediately after establishing its omnipotence, Spurgeon pivots to describing faith as incredibly weak and fragile. How do we reconcile the theological omnipotence of faith with its practical fragility?
This is where Spurgeon's pastoral realism really shines. He is deeply aware of the psychological and spiritual mechanics of the human heart. He acknowledges that while faith in the abstract phase as it exists in the mind of God is invincible, human faith in practice is a highly volatile, fragile entity. It demands constant, vigilant preservation.
He offers a personal confession that resonates deeply. He admits to his congregation that his own faith often feels exactly strong enough to bear the specific trouble of that particular day, but not a single atom more. He says, I could not afford to take the least atom off.
That is the lived reality of most believers. You wake up and you feel you have just enough trust in God's providence to survive the crisis in front of you. But if one more variable is introduced, an unexpected bill, a sick child, a harsh word, the entire system threatens to crash. He describes human faith as a tender plant left outside in the frost, easily nipped by a passing goat or chilled by the winter wind.
Because it is inherently fragile in our experience, it must be aggressively nurtured. It cannot be left on autopilot. And Spurgeon argues that the only way faith survives is through forward momentum. He uses a mechanical analogy. A wheel will remain erect as long as it moves, but when it begins to stand still, it falls.
It is the exact physics of a bicycle or a gyroscope. The structural stability is entirely derived from the forward momentum. The moment the forward progress ceases, gravity takes over and it tips over. In the spiritual realm, stagnation is the precursor to collapse. The Christian is maintained by progress.
Therefore, the Apostles' prayer, increase our faith, is not a one-time request. It is the necessary, continuous posture of the believer. Spurgeon identifies two specific structural ways that this forward momentum of faith must be increased. It must be increased in its extent, and it must be increased in its intensity.
Let us unpack the concept of extent first, because it offers a fascinating glimpse into Spurgeon's theological operating system. The extent of faith refers to the breadth of what a believer is willing to receive and believe from the Word of God.
Right, because when a person first enters the Christian life, their faith naturally doesn't grasp much. It is usually confined to the elementary doctrines of salvation, the reality of sin, and the saving work of Christ on the cross. But Spurgeon observes that many believers stagnate there. They refuse to let their faith expand to encompass the wider, deeper mysteries of God's sovereignty, His providence, and His complex grace.
And here, Spurgeon levels a massive critique against narrow-minded sectarianism and rigid bigotry. This is remarkable, coming from a towering figure of Reformed theology. He describes believers who possess miserable, cramped souls. They learn what he calls a cast-iron creed. They draw up 5 or 6 rigid doctrinal points, declare that these points encapsulate the entirety of biblical truth, and refuse to believe a single syllable outside of that framework.
He actually prays for these rigid sectarians, saying, Lord, increase their faith. He prays that God would grant them a wider heart and a broader theological horizon. He explicitly calls out denominational tribalism. He says, Lord, help them to believe that there are good Christian Wesleyans and good church people, and that God's elect are scattered everywhere, not just in their specific chapel.
This is a crucial data point for understanding Spurgeon's specific brand of Calvinism. He deeply revered the standard Reformed divines. He frequently praised John Calvin and John Gill, but he vehemently refused to be locked in what he called their little iron cages. He believed that the Word of God was vastly larger than any single human systematic theology. He wanted to spread his sails on untried seas. Expanding the extent of your faith means cultivating a theological humility that recognizes there is always more of God's truth to be discovered and understood.
So we must increase our faith in its extent, breaking out of cast iron cages to apprehend the vastness of God's truth. But we must also increase our faith in its intensity. If extent is the surface area of the lake, intensity is the depth. It is about how firmly and fiercely faith holds on to the specific promises it has apprehended.
Spurgeon traces a beautiful anatomical progression of how faith grips a promise. He says that when faith is young and weak, it takes God's mercy with an open palm.
An open palm is receptive, but it is highly insecure. If someone bumps your arm or if the wind blows, whatever is resting on an open palm is easily knocked away.
Precisely. As faith increases through trial and exercise, it learns to hold the promise with the fingers. It wraps around the truth. But when faith reaches full maturity, when it becomes great faith, it takes hold of the promise as with an iron vise. It grasps the word of God so fiercely and with such mechanical leverage that neither the terror of death nor the forces of hell could wend the promise from its grip.
He contrasts the young Christian, who is shaken by every minor theological dispute or personal tragedy, with the seasoned veteran believer. He says the old Christian can stand against old Boreas, the mythological Greek god of the violent north wind, and 50 of his winds, and remain entirely unmoved because their faith is calcified into an iron vise around the character of God.
Spurgeon pushes this concept of intensity even further, moving from mere stability into the realm of mystical apprehension. He quotes a hymn by Isaac Watts about desiring a stronger faith to look within the veil of eternity. He talks about the spiritual experience of climbing the hill called Clear, ascending to the top of Mount Pisgah, the mountain where Moses viewed the promised land, and bathing your eyes in the splendor of heaven before you ever arrive there.
He wants his congregation to plunge their souls in rivers of bliss here on earth. He is describing a faith so intense, so hyper-focused on the reality of the unseen world, that the believer actually begins to experience the beatific vision in the present. It is not just holding on for dear life in a storm. It is holding on so tightly that the barrier between heaven and earth becomes porous.
It is a profound call to spiritual maturation, but it leaves the listener with an urgent, practical dilemma. If the Christian life requires us to expand our faith beyond our cast iron creeds and to intensify our grip until it rivals an iron vise, where exactly do we go to acquire this upgrade? The mechanics of human effort cannot manufacture supernatural faith.
That brings us to Spurgeon's final critical instruction regarding the source of increase, which culminates in a chilling warning to those entirely without faith. When the apostles in Luke 17 realized they were bankrupt, they did not look inward. They did not resolve to simply try harder. They didn't convene a committee to discuss strategies for increasing faith. And significantly, they didn't go to their human ministers. They directed their cry exclusively to the source. To the Lord, increase our faith.
Spurgeon is ruthlessly clear about the limitations of human agency here, including his own. He tells his congregation that as a minister, he possesses rhetorical power. He says, "I could inflate your faith till it turned into presumption, but I could not make it grow." That distinction between inflation and actual cellular growth is vital.
Right. A gifted communicator can manipulate emotions. A pastor can hype up a congregation, pump them full of adrenaline, and inflate their confidence until they feel invincible. But inflation is hollow. The moment the emotional high fades, or the moment real pressure is applied, the balloon pops. True faith requires organic cellular growth at the level of the soul, and only the author and perfecter of faith can generate that.
Therefore, Spurgeon instructs his listeners that whatever their current circumstance, it must become the catalyst for driving them to the throne of God to plead for more faith. He applies it across the entire spectrum of human experience. If your money is accumulating and you are experiencing prosperity, go to the Lord, because wealth has a gravitational pull that corrupts the heart, and you need increased faith to navigate it without making an idol of it.
If your property is diminishing and you are facing ruin, take it to the Lord. If you are sick, weary, and full of physical pain, do not just seek medical relief. Go to the tabernacle of God. He calls the presence of God the hothouse where tender plants are grown. You must transplant your fragile faith into the climate of God's presence if it is to survive the frost of the world.
But then, in the closing moments of the sermon, Spurgeon executes a radical rhetorical shift. The tone drops. The encouragement ceases. He turns his attention away from struggling believers in the room and addresses those who possess absolutely zero faith, those who have not even the mustard seed. And he asks them a devastating existential question. What will you do in the next world without faith?
It is an utterly terrifying conclusion. He forces the unbeliever to confront the impending reality of their own mortality. He reminds them that they stand on the crumbling edge of the vast gulf of an unknown future, and that with every single beat of their pulse, their soul is dragged one step closer to eternity. To convey the sheer horror of entering the spiritual realm without the regenerative work of faith, he employs three highly visceral physical metaphors. He describes a spiritual state in terms of profound physical mutilation.
This is where his diagnostic work reaches its terrifying climax. He argues that faith is not just a belief system, it provides the actual sensory faculties of the soul. His first metaphor focuses on the faculty of flight. The unbeliever has no wings.
He says that faith gives wings to the soul. When a Christian faces the gulf of death, they flap the wings of faith and fly over the abyss into heaven. Even if they stumble in life, they flap their wings and rise again. But the unbeliever has no wings. For them, stepping into eternity is not a flight. It is a blind leap into perdition. He describes it as a perpetual descent through a bottomless pit. The soul is constantly struggling to rise, thrashing in the void, but utterly unable to elevate itself because the necessary faculty of flight faith is entirely missing.
It is the architecture of pure existential dread, an eternal conscious freefall. He compounds this with a second metaphor. The unbeliever has no eyes. Faith, he argues, is the optic nerve of the soul. It provides the eyes to see the unseen, to perceive the evidence of things not seen.
When a Christian dies, they enter the next world with their eyes wide open, capable of perceiving the glory of God and the hosts of angels. But the unbeliever, having never exercised faith, dies a blind and eyeless spirit. They are thrust into the eternal realm, shut out forever from even the feeblest ray of joy or hope. They are surrounded by the realities of eternity, but are entirely incapable of perceiving the splendors of paradise. They are an eyeless spirit trapped in the dark.
And finally, he delivers the third and perhaps most tragic metaphor. The unbeliever has no hands. Throughout the sermon, he has defined faith as the receptive hand of the soul.
Spurgeon paints a hypothetical picture of agonizing proximity. He says, suppose an angel descends to waft you to bliss, or suppose even Christ himself is standing there at the threshold of eternity. The unbeliever possesses no spiritual hands to clasp the angel. They have no hands to reach out and touch the hem of Christ's garment. Even if divine mercy were held out directly to them, they do not possess the anatomical spiritual capacity to lay hold of it. They cannot grip the gates of heaven to pull them open.
He uses this imagery to directly challenge the arrogance of the unbeliever. He dismantles the pride that assumes one can simply negotiate or force their way into heaven at the last moment. He asks, dost thou intend to rend down the gates of heaven? Dost thou think thou hast omnipotence enough to force thy way through squadrons of cherubim, and so to enter by main force? It is an absolute rhetorical demolition of human self-sufficiency. You cannot muscle your way into the divine presence. Without the grace of faith, you are wingless, eyeless, and handless as you step into the swelling currents of the Jordan River.
It provides a stark, absolute contrast that frames the entire sermon. You have the Christian lark equipped with wings, eyes, and hands, soaring into the sun, bathing in the rivers of bliss.
Yeah.
You have the eyeless spirit falling endlessly into the abyss. He leaves the unbeliever with no ground to stand on, pressing upon them the absolute terrifying urgency of crying out for the simple germs of faith before the pulse stops beating.
He masterfully takes a simple four-word prayer, increase our faith, and expands it into a comprehensive theology of survival, sanctification, and eternal reality.
We have covered a massive amount of theological and practical ground today. We have diagnosed faith not as a static checkbox on a theological exam, but as the vital operational engine of the believer. We have seen it as the non-meritorious keel of the ship, keeping you afloat in justification. We have seen it as the root system manufacturing love and patience. We have seen it as the live telegraph wire pulling down real-time blessings from heaven, the iron vice gripping God's promises in the storm, and the very hands, eyes, and wings of the soul as we approach eternity.
It is the crown jewel of the Christian virtues, the supreme instrument by which God has chosen to interact with humanity, exactly as Spurgeon argued in 1855 and exactly as it remains today.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. A thought that builds on Spurgeon's profound architecture, but pushes it just a bit further into the unknown. Spurgeon claims that faith gives us the eyes and hands we need to cross the gulf into the next world. It is the faculty that allows us to perceive and grasp the reality of heaven. But this raises a fascinating, almost paradoxical question about the nature of eternity itself. Many of us operate under the assumption that if heaven is a place where all promises are finally and physically fulfilled, and we are at last standing face to face with God, then faith simply completes its job and evaporates into pure sight. We assume the telegraph wire is disconnected because you are finally sitting in the same room as the one you were messaging.
That makes logical sense on the surface.
Right, but consider the infinite, inexhaustible nature of God. God is not a static object to be completely comprehended in a single glance. He is endless. Could it be that because God's glory and character are completely boundless, even in eternity, our capacity for faith, our ability to trust Him for the next revelation, to step further into the uncharted depths of who He is, will actually continue to increase forever? Will we spend a trillion years in the presence of God, still praying, increase our faith, not out of weakness or desperation, but out of an endless, expanding capacity for wonder? Think about the extent and the intensity of your own faith this week. Check the keel of your ship. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We will see you next time.